Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shocked the conscience of humanity. Daily reports of Russian atrocities appear in the news. We've seen videos of bombed-out apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, theaters, and churches. We've heard accounts of torture chambers, mass graves, and bodies bound and shot execution style. Evidence is mounting that this is part of a plan to ethnically cleanse eastern Ukraine and intimidate the Ukrainian population into submission. Worldwide cries for accountability are deafening. But are Vladimir Putin and other Russian leaders beyond the reach of international criminal law? I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, I've assembled a panel of leading experts to discuss the options and obstacles to bringing Russian leaders to justice. Right after the news. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast, our expert panelists will be discussing the options and obstacles to bringing Russian leaders to justice for the crime of aggression and war crimes in the Ukraine. In our first segment, we will discuss the international crimes that have been committed and the possibilities of prosecuting in national courts. In the second segment, we will examine the prospects of prosecuting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide in the International Criminal Court. And in the final segment, we'll explore proposals to create a special international tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression. For the program today, I've assembled a panel of individuals intimately involved in various efforts to prosecute Russian atrocities. Joining us once again from the nation's capital is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize-nominated non-governmental organization. Paul's NGO has interviewed hundreds of Ukrainian refugees in Poland to document war crimes, and we are so glad to have you back here today, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I'm excited to be back.
And from Asheville, North Carolina, we have a special guest, David Crane, the former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. David has produced a draft indictment of Russian leaders and a statute for a tribunal to prosecute Russia's crime of aggression. Dave, it's been a few years since you've appeared on Talking Foreign Policy. It is so good to have you back.
It's great to be back, and greetings from the Smoky Mountains.
And joining us for the first time from New York City is Jennifer Trahan. She's a professor of global affairs at NYU and head of the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression. Jennifer has been assisting the ambassador of Liechtenstein in drafting a proposal for a tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, Jen.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here.
And then with me in the Idea Stream studio here in Cleveland is Professor Milena Stereo, a chaired international law professor at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. And Milena joined me in February in making an amicus argument before the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So she's a super expert at the ICC. It is good to have you back on the program, Milena.
It's a pleasure to be back here, Michael.
So let's kick things off. I'm going to ask Paul Williams to start by summarizing the Russian invasion and the state of the war in Ukraine.
Well, Michael, this has been a phenomenal 8 years of angst and aggression by the Russians against the independent state of Ukraine. Back in February of 2014, the Russians invaded and then annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, followed shortly thereafter in April of 2014, where they sought to occupy substantial parts of the Donbas region. And then most recently, as we've all been aware of, in February 24th of this year, they launched an all-out attack, essentially trying to occupy the whole of Ukraine. The Ukrainians pushed back. They effectively defended Kyiv and defended other territories, and then began to roll back the advances of the Russians. We saw just recently, the Ukrainians made an attack, a strategically militarily important attack on the supply bridge from Russian mainland territory to the annexed Crimea. And then recently, the Russians have been responding with indiscriminate attacks on train stations and other areas throughout Ukraine, essentially amounting to atrocity crimes.
Well, and Paul, all wars are messy and there's always some war crimes, but this one seems to be showing the Russians' particular brand of cruelty. Let me turn to Professor Milena Stereo. Can you tell us what international crimes appear to have been committed by Russian nationals in this conflict, and how are these crimes being documented?
Several grave international crimes seem to have been committed. First of all, aggression. Under international law, aggression is defined as use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state. It is crystal clear in this instant that Russia has used armed forces against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of Ukraine. It also appears that Russian troops have committed war crimes, such as, for example, crimes of sexual violence, torture, other mistreatment of civilians, as well as prisoners of war, and they have also conducted indiscriminate shellings of civilian objectives. Russian troops probably also committed crimes against humanity, which are crimes committed on a widespread and systematic basis against Ukrainian civilians. And finally, there have been allegations of genocide. Now, these crimes are being documented by various domestic and international civil society organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations. One of such non-governmental organizations conducting documentation is the Public International Law and Policy Group, and both Professor Paul Williams and I are involved in those efforts.
I want to follow up on this crime of genocide. It's sometimes called the crime of all crimes. I think it's pretty clear just from the videos we're seeing that war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed. But Milena, what is the definition of genocide, and why do you think that there might be a case for that crime being committed?
Genocide is a particularly difficult crime to prove and to prosecute because it requires that the perpetrator have specific intent to kill or harm members of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group on account of their membership in this group. And so as a prosecutor, you really have to prove that there is such a specific intent to commit these crimes against members of one of these protected groups. Here, we have recently seen footage on Russian television of Russian officials publicly saying how Ukrainians need to be exterminated, essentially. And so that would be evidence, if I were the prosecutor, no, you could use that evidence as evidence of this genocidal intent, or at least of evidence of incitement to commit genocide. If I had to draw a parallel to another situation, I would compare this to Rwanda, where in the context of the Rwandan genocide, we had public broadcasting messages calling for one of the ethnic groups to kill members of the other.
And now let's go to the Smoky Mountains and turn to our Chief Prosecutor, David Crane. David, you've prepared draft indictments for a number of Russian leaders. Can you summarize a few of those for us and tell us about the theories of liabilities for those?
I'm glad to, Michael. And again, it's just great to be talking to all of you. We haven't seen these kind of tactics since World War II. The old Soviet army, now the Russian army, uses tactics that they're almost barbaric. That's the way they do things. They're clearly violating many international norms and statutes, but clearly in the laws of armed conflict, the Russian army has totally ignored it. And as we were putting together our sample indictments for the world to consider, it was very, very easy to show that Vladimir Putin, as the head of state and also the commander of all the armed forces, all the way down to commanders in the field, are committing war crimes and totally ignoring the rule of law. Of course, their soldiers are following this terrible example. And so we're seeing widespread violations, attack on civilians, civilian targets, protected places, those things that the laws of armed conflict, which are really all about protections on the battlefield, ensuring that the conflict is managed, is totally out of control. So they are the gravamen that you'll find in the sample indictments is just just a widespread attack on civilian targets and civilians, which are under the laws of armed conflict, particularly the Geneva Conventions. Civilians are especially to be protected, and they're ignoring all of those cautions.
So, Dave, I can understand the military leaders and even Putin, who is commander-in-chief like our president. But I remember that one of your indictments was about the foreign minister, Lavrov. What's your theory of liability for him?
Well, again, Lavrov gets sucked into, at a minimum, aiding and abetting aggression. And I think that this is a kind of a cutting-edge theory of liability that we put into the sample indictments regarding aggression, was that this brings in the not only the military aspect of this aggression, but also the political leadership that surrounds Putin. So, clearly Vladimir Putin is president and head of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, clearly is committing international crimes and aggression. But those around him, the national security advisor, the minister of defense, the foreign minister, Lavrov, they're all clearly aiding and abetting, along with the senior commanders in the field, aiding and abetting aggression, which is really the core international offense of the invasion.
And everything flows from that. Let me go to Paul Williams and ask you, I know that Ukraine has prosecuted some low-level people that just fell into its custody, but can leaders of Russia be prosecuted in domestic courts in Ukraine and other countries throughout Europe?
Well, Michael, there's a legal and a practical dimension to your question. Legally, yes, the Ukrainians have the legal authority to prosecute any individual who has committed atrocity crime, including Putin, Lavrov, senior generals of the Russian military. As you noted, they've already had 10 successful war crimes prosecutions. There's two difficulties, though, with this. The first of which is, the perception of legitimacy, which I would not overstate, but it's oftentimes important to have an international tribunal to establish that legitimacy or reflect that legitimacy. And the second is expertise. The Ukrainians have highly skilled, phenomenal prosecutors, but no one, except for these last 10, have ever prosecuted someone for war crimes before. You and I have talked about this on other programs. It's not something that people specialize in domestically because it's so rare. Unfortunately, it's a little less rare than we would like it to be. So yes, the Ukrainians have the legal authority to do it, but it's a fairly substantial ask.
And let me turn to Jennifer. Can the Russian president and the foreign minister be prosecuted by a domestic court outside of Russia, or is that blocked by something called head of state immunity?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Michael. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So we say that aggression is a leadership crime. So you're looking for those who planned, prepared, initiated, or executed the crime. So those are going to be high-level political or military leaders. That's at least under the international definition. And we do hit this issue of potential head of state immunity, at least before national courts. So this could be an issue both in Ukraine and if there are courts in other countries, such as some of the European countries have opened investigations, and these could be precluded. There was this case called Eurodia from the International Court of Justice suggesting that result.
All right, well, we've talked about domestic prosecutions. It's time for a short break. When we return, we're going to be looking at the investigation and prosecution of Russian leaders by the International Criminal Court. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today by the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams. I'm also with the former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, David Crane. And we have the head of the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression, Jennifer Trahan, with us. And finally, we have an expert in international criminal law from Cleveland Marshall College of Law, Milena Stereo, here in studio. We're talking about the challenges and obstacles of prosecuting Russia and Russian nationals for war crimes in the Ukraine. And in the last segment, we were just hearing from Jennifer Trahan about why the top leaders cannot be prosecuted in domestic courts because of something called head of state immunity. In this segment of our show, I'd like to focus the discussion on prosecution before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's also called the ICC. Milena, can you tell us a little bit about the ICC?
Sure. The ICC is the only permanent international criminal court. It has been around for about 20 years. It is located at The Hague in the Netherlands, and it has jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. There are currently 123 member states to the ICC, and important to note, the United States is not a member, nor are Ukraine or Russia. The court has jurisdiction in situations where either the United Nations Security Council refers the case to the court, or where the crime is committed on the territory of a member state or by a national of a member state.
So let me turn to Jennifer. If, as Milena says, Russia is not a party to the treaty and the Security Council has not referred this case, how does the ICC have jurisdiction over Russian war crimes in Ukraine?
Ukraine has done something which is called executing an Article 12.3 declaration. I know that sounds very technical, but it's kind of like becoming a state party, but not quite. But it has created jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed in the territory of Ukraine. The problem is what it's not done is created any jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. Ukraine alone can't do that because under the International Criminal Court statute, we're in this position, which I think is pretty unfortunate, that there's a lot less jurisdiction for the ICC over the crime of aggression, and it can't prosecute the nationals of non-states parties. So Russia is not a state party, and for instance, Belarus, which allowed its territory to be used as a staging ground for the invasion, they're also not a state party. So we're in the position where nationals of Russia or Belarus could not be prosecuted for the crime of aggression. And that's why I think in the third part we'll discuss other alternatives.
But the ICC still can prosecute these horrible crimes, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and even genocide. Now let me turn to our Chief Prosecutor, David Crane. David, the ICC has announced that it has initiated an investigation into Russian war crimes in Ukraine. What does that mean?
Well, it's really, in fact, executing its mandate and moving forward into the Ukraine with a large body of investigators, an excellent team headed by an American, Brenda Hollis. And they're starting to collect evidence in and around the Ukraine related to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and of course genocide, which I agree that it's difficult to prove but can be proven. So that's what they're doing right now. They're doing it carefully, slowly, to ensure that they have a proper case, because again, the stakes are very high here. When you move in and are considering indicting a head of state, which I did back in March of 2003, President Charles Taylor of Liberia, you have to have your act together and do it slowly, carefully, and when it's time to go ahead and sign an indictment against sitting head of state and his henchmen, which would be the commanders around him and in the field who are violating the laws of armed conflict and perpetrating all of these international crimes.
David, it seems to me that this is a case where getting enough evidence is not going to be difficult. The difficulty is going to be that the ICC will be overwhelmed by a mountain of evidence. How should they sift through all of that?
It's a real challenge, and I've been talking about this among yourselves as well as other colleagues, and to include the Ukrainian Bar Association and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Justice. And we know this. The challenge is we have too many people stepping all over the crime scene. Everybody has a good heart, but in reality, there's no central point of contact. So everybody is gathering evidence, some of it professionally. We all are head of various organizations like ours, the Global Accountability Network, doing it professionally, carefully, chain of custody, etc. But there are a lot of individuals who want to do well go in, bring people in, but are actually messing up these crime scenes. It's a real challenge in that regard, but also just in this day and age where we have the ability to just accumulate data, which is really what it is. At this point in time, in my opinion, 95% of the data that's being gathered cannot be used in a domestic or an international tribunal of court of law. The challenges are the rules of procedure and evidence. So there's a real practical problem here for the ICC, and that is we need to centralize our ability to take this data, turn it into criminal information, and then eventually evidence where we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt each and every element of the international crimes that are committed. But yeah, it's a great question, Michael, because it's truly a problem right now is everybody's doing so much, but actually getting in each other's way.
So let me turn to Milena and ask, what are the next steps from the investigation to the indictment to eventual prosecution, and how long is this likely to take?
Sure. Actually, in this case, the ICC, I should mention, the ICC had already opened a so-called preliminary examination several years ago in the wake of the Donbass and Crimea crises when Russia had already used force against Ukraine, and that was under the leadership of the previous prosecutor.
Back in 2014.
Correct. Yeah. And so that preliminary examination took place, and then fast forward to February of 2022, in the wake of the current aggression by Russia, the current prosecutor of the ICC then opened an investigation. As David Crane just explained to us, the issue here is really gathering all the evidence and gathering the evidence that's actually usable in court of law. Once the ICC prosecutor determines that there is enough evidence to proceed, then the court can issue indictments against specific individuals, such as, for example, Putin or other Russian leaders, because remember that the ICC is a criminal court which prosecutes individuals. It is not prosecuting the state of Russia. It is going to be prosecuting specific individuals. And then the court can issue arrest warrants against those individuals. Now, the problem with putting on the actual trial is that the ICC, under the ICC statute, trials in absentia, where the defendant is not actually present physically, are not allowed. And so the real challenge is going to be being able to arrest the individuals whom the ICC actually wants to prosecute.
So let's focus in on that issue. The ICC has had a mixed record at best of getting custody over the people it has indicted. Let me turn to David. David, Sudanese President al-Bashir was indicted by the ICC for genocide 15 years ago, but he's never been surrendered to the court. Saif Gaddafi, the son of the former Libyan president, he was indicted for crimes against humanity a dozen years ago, but he's never been surrendered to the court. Charles Coney, the notorious leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, he was indicted for crimes against humanity by the ICC a decade ago, and he's still at large in Africa after a dozen years. How likely, Dave, is it that indicted Russian leaders are actually going to be brought to trial at The Hague?
Well, there's a couple points we need to kind of flesh out here. The world, the international community, has to come together in support of Ukraine and also to prosecute the international crimes being perpetrated by the Russian Federation. So the fact that the world comes together, along with the International Criminal Court, and indicts the leadership of the Russian Federation for international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide in the ICC, and perhaps another justice mechanism to prosecute them for aggression, sends a tremendous signal for those who choose to step away from the rule of law. So the indictment is the cornerstone, and which really is really the stake in the ground, letting leaders around the world, to include those who are indicted, that they cannot get away with perpetrating atrocity against human beings. And so I think it's really critical that we tend to think, well, we can't get them, therefore we shouldn't be doing anything. The answer is no. We should move forward and properly, under rules of procedure and evidence, indict these individuals and stick the stake in the ground saying, no more, you cannot do this. Your listeners need to understand that there's really no statute of limitations on international crimes. So we may not get them before a court, maybe ever, but we could. There may become a political circumstance within Russia, sooner or later, that will allow Russia to hand over those individuals who have been indicted for a fair and open trial. So that's really important. Yeah. And, when I indicted Charles Taylor, they didn't hand him over to us for another 2 years, but he was handed over. He got a fair and open trial. He was found guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity, and he's going to spend the rest of his life now in His Majesty's maximum security prison in England.
Yeah,
So,
I see the symbolic value of an indictment. Let me turn to Paul and ask about, are there any practical benefits of indicting Russian leaders even if they're never brought to trial?
Well, Michael, I think there's two practical elements, and the first one isn't really your question, but I'll just answer it anyways, which is never underestimate the long arm of the law. As David mentioned, Taylor, former president of Liberia, was eventually captured. Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic. The list goes on of individuals that were never going to appear before a tribunal if they were indicted. They were indicted. They appeared before a tribunal. They're serving time. But secondly, truth matters. If an international criminal court or some type of hybrid mechanism indicts a senior leader or president, a foreign minister for atrocity crimes, that matters when it comes to sanctions, maintaining the political will to provide military assistance to the Ukrainians, getting through what is going to be a very cold winter in Europe. The fact that you're doing it because you're pushing back on an agenda of a war criminal. Well, how do we know they're a war criminal? Well, look, they've been indicted by the International Criminal Court. That's very important for this magical political will, which we all, strive to have, come into being in order to stop these types of atrocities. So yes, definitely an indictment, regardless of whether.
If Putin is indicted, won't that make it harder to make a peace deal with him at the end of the conflict?
Peace deal? You think Putin's serious about a peace deal? I think we kid ourselves sometimes by thinking that we need to get to yes with war criminals, so to speak. A war criminal is a war criminal, and if you have an international court identify someone through a legitimate and a fair process as a war criminal, that's important to know when you're trying to deal with that individual, as opposed to closing your eyes and, we just have to get to yes. We have to, quote unquote, save lives. We've learned with what happened in Crimea in 2014 and Donbass, that closing your eyes to these atrocities and trying to get to yes with someone who's a war criminal just leads to more war crimes and more deaths.
All right, well, let's assume hypothetically that you and David are right, that eventually Putin and the other leaders fall from power or just wind up somewhere that surrenders them to The Hague. Milena, if they are eventually prosecuted, what defenses would these leaders likely to assert at their trial? Do they have any defenses?
Well, I'm not sure that they would be, successful, but there are defenses that are allowed under the statute of the International Criminal Court. Some defenses or grounds for excluding criminal responsibility include things like duress, which is essentially I didn't have free will, someone else made me do it. Putin couldn't really claim this, but another Russian leader could presumably say Putin made me do it. There are also things like, for example, mental illness or incapacity or intoxication. I also think that it's likely that some of these leaders might be prosecuted under this mode of liability called command responsibility, which is when acts of subordinates are imputed to their superiors. And it is possible that some of these defendants would say some of the elements of command responsibility are simply not met. For example, I didn't actually order the troops to do something. I didn't know that they were about to do something bad. They did it, but it's really not my fault. Not likely that any of these defenses would be successful, but there are defenses that are allowed and possible under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
And I can see how we would all assume if Putin was brought to The Hague that it'd be an open and shut case. But the ICC really doesn't have that great a track record of successful prosecutions. So Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of the Ivory Coast, Jean-Pierre Bemba, the former vice president of the Central African Republic, Mathieu Chui, a Congolese military leader, they were all acquitted or had their convictions overturned on appeal in just the last couple of years. And the case against the former vice president of Kenya, William Ruto, that was dismissed for insufficient evidence. So, Paul, what does that say about the ICC's ability to successfully prosecute Russian leaders for war crimes?
Well, Michael, I think it tells us that justice actually works. Not everyone indicted for a war crime is actually guilty of that war crime. I think the individuals we're talking about here, Foreign Minister Lavrov, President Putin, some of the most serious generals, We're watching it unfold right before us on television and on the internet, so we know what's happening. But I think the International Criminal Court has some high standards for both the indictment and then the eventual prosecution and proof that someone is a war criminal. So I think we should embrace the fact that as these processes move forward, we know that there's a high level of legitimacy given these cases that you've just mentioned.
I think that's a great point, but often when you have a leader on trial, their goal is to try to make the court look illegitimate. So, David, let me ask you this. Trials of leaders for war crimes, they tend to be extremely messy. I'm thinking of the experience with the Saddam Hussein trial and the Milosevic trial, and even the Charles Taylor trial had its moments. Is that what a trial of Russian leaders at the ICC would likely resemble?
Well, historically, these kind of individuals, these heads of state or senior leaders, we saw this with Goering at Nuremberg, what have you, try to turn it into a political event so that they can speak directly to the citizens of the country of which they were head of state once. And so they do intentionally try to do that. It's not a defense, and it can be incredibly disruptive. So that you have to just understand that, stick to the rules of procedure and evidence. This is where leadership at the bench, strong judges, control what's going on in the courtroom, can rein that in fairly well. And we've seen that happen both from Nuremberg all the way up to the Charles Taylor trial itself. So it's really, really important. But just let me add just something very quickly to what Paul was saying in the previous question. When I was drafting the indictments of a sitting head of state, President Charles Taylor, my standard is that I won't sign the indictment until we could prove each and every element of each and every crime that I charged him with beyond a reasonable doubt before I signed it. Because you have to make sure, if you're going to go after heads of state, you can't make a mistake, because you don't want to have a retrial of a sitting head of state or his very senior leaders. So from a practical point of view, and for someone who actually has done it, my standard was I don't sign that indictment until we've already got him. And then when we issue the indictment, for a large measure, it's just a matter then of going through the procedure in court to make that happen. You've got to be careful on that, because you can't make these mistakes at the international level, because it just cheapens, frankly, the opinion of others as to why do we even try these international
Dave,
crimes?
those seem like very wise words. It's time for us to take another short break. When we return, we'll be talking about the proposal to establish a tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression related to Ukraine. We'll be back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts in international criminal law and the crisis in Ukraine. In this final segment, we're going to be discussing the proposal to prosecute Russian leaders for the crime of aggression. Jennifer Trahan, let's begin with you. You're the head of the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression. Can you tell us about how the crime of aggression came about? I know that Milena Stereo has already given us a definition, but what's the background on this?
Sure, Michael. So it has early lineage. Starting in even 1917, there were Americans who were thinking about how do we prevent aggressive war? How do we outlaw war? Because war historically had just been how states resolved disputes. And there really is this turning point. And it starts turning in 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, led by the US and France and other states joining that war should be illegal. And then that's attempted, of course, again in the UN Charter. And that's the core provision against aggression that we have in the UN Charter. But we have a really important turning point in terms of individual criminal responsibility. That is, that individuals are responsible for the crime, that it's not enough to just say, okay, Russia is responsible, but individual leaders. And those prosecutions regarding the crime and individual responsibility first happened at Nuremberg. And this is a little known fact that the key focus of Nuremberg is actually not on the Holocaust, but on the crime of aggression. And that kind of sets up the situation where we are today, that where we have this crime defined, it's been a very clear violation of the UN Charter, a manifest one. So we clearly have had the crime occurred. But as I mentioned in the first section, we have a gap in the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. And we have this problem of immunities at the domestic level. And that leads us into the idea there needs to be some kind of gap filler.
Well, I'm reminded of the fact that ultimately Al Capone was brought down and prosecuted successfully for tax evasion. And that was a great success because you took a major Chicago gangster off the streets and you put him in jail for the rest of his life. We know that the International Criminal Court can prosecute Putin for war crimes and crimes against humanity and even genocide. Why is it so important, Jennifer, that they also prosecute Putin somewhere for the crime of aggression?
Yeah, great question, Michael. Well, first, I don't know if the ICC will prosecute Putin. So for war crime, you have like your firsthand perpetrator who most directly commits it. Then you might look to like a mid-level commander. But does the proof actually go all the way up to Putin? Milena mentioned command responsibility, potentially. So we just really don't know if the International Criminal Court will be going to that level. But the crime of aggression is different. So it is the leaders who initiate the war. And for that one, it's very obvious that you would be looking to high-level political or military leaders. But in the Nuremberg judgment, they also refer to the crime as the supreme crime. And what they mean by that is it contains all the other crimes within it. So if we didn't have the aggression, we wouldn't be seeing the war crimes. We wouldn't be seeing the crimes against humanity. And it's even broader than that because there's also all these civilians who are dying who are not necessarily being killed as a result of a war crime, because the laws of war do tolerate, in a horrible term, collateral damage. So, some individuals are dying as a result of that, and there won't necessarily be war crimes charges. But the crime of aggression encompasses that. It even encompasses all the killing of military on both sides. The Ukrainians who never should have been forced to fight in an illegal war, and even the Russians, and now we're seeing so many of them who don't want to fight in this illegal war. So that's why it's the supreme crime, and that's why it really matters.
Well, I hadn't really thought of it that way. That is extremely helpful. Let me ask a follow-up for Milena. So the Security Council is paralyzed because Russia has a veto as one of the 5 permanent members. So it's not going to create a tribunal for aggression. It's not going to refer Russian aggression to the International Criminal Court. What options then are there for creating a tribunal to prosecute Russian leaders for the crime of aggression without Security Council involvement?
Well, let me just mention that even without creating a special tribunal, one at least theoretical option would be to amend the statute of the International Criminal Court to broaden the jurisdictional regime over the crime of aggression. And there have been groups such as, for example, Parliamentarians for Global Action, which have advocated for this option. It's unlikely, but in theory, it's possible. Now, another option, if you're going down the path of creating a special ad hoc tribunal, if you say the ICC cannot prosecute aggression, one way to do it would be to sign an agreement, to have an agreement signed between the United Nations General Assembly and Ukraine. And we already have precedent for such agreements creating hybrid tribunals, such as, for example, the Special Court for Sierra Leone or the Cambodia Tribunal. And finally, another option that I would mention to prosecute the crime of aggression would be in the national courts of Ukraine. But as we mentioned previously, the problem with this is that you really could only prosecute mid or lower level offenders. And the problem with this is that, as Jennifer just laid out, aggression is a leadership crime and you couldn't prosecute people like Putin in the national courts because of immunity.
Now, this is what makes this show really cool, because David and Jennifer, you both are part of groups of experts with different proposals for the UN to create a tribunal to prosecute Russian leaders for the crime of aggression. You're in the middle of the mix of all this. Can you tell us how your proposals differ? Let's start with David.
Well, actually, our proposals really don't differ at all. They both focus on the fact that we have to prosecute the crime of aggression, which is an international affront to the United Nations. It has to be prosecuted. It has to be done by the United Nations. There is talk about having Europe create some type of justice mechanism to prosecute the crime of aggression. But this invasion is not a European problem, it's an international problem. And so the United Nations as a body has to, in fact, prosecute this. So again, I don't think we differ. I think we're both pilgrims heading to Jerusalem, and we'll eventually get there.
Jennifer,
but there's not a lot of difference between the two of setting up the special tribunal for Ukraine.
Jennifer, are there any nuances, any minor differences you can point to?
I have to agree with David. We're really arguing the basically the same thing. We have time. I think we differed on the working languages of the tribunal. We might have different ideas of where to put it, but these are in the little details. And I think ultimately both of us are setting out what could be negotiated, and the details ultimately have to be negotiated between the UN and Ukraine. So we can, set out what we think should happen. And I actually think it's a really strong statement that working independently, we came out with pretty much the same answer on the best way that we think this should be done, which would be an international tribunal and going through the UN, because even if they could get him, Ukrainian courts, and even if we had the most skilled judges, they're not going to look neutral. And as David said, this also isn't a European issue. What is at issue is global order. Do we care about, it's called Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which is the basic prohibition against aggression. And we will never know if there was too tepid a response in Crimea that got us to where we are today. And if we don't do something now, are we going to be talking next about the invasion of Taiwan? We just don't want to get there. And it's for this reason that David and I think this needs to be taken up at the level of the UN, and not solely, by a couple of countries or by any kind of European tribunal. So that is both what we're both advocating for.
All right. So, David, you are in partnership with Hans Corell, the former legal advisor of the UN. Jennifer, you're in partnership with the ambassador from Liechtenstein, who used to be the president of the International Criminal Court's Assembly of State Parties. You've got very heavy hitters involved in these proposals. Can you give us a status update? Where are we with each of these proposals?
Well, let me go ahead and start. And again, I echo Jennifer's. I agree with her entirely. And again, this is an affront against the United Nations and this aggression. If the United Nations doesn't do something about this, then why have a United Nations? That's just a rhetorical question. Where we are right now is we're moving forward carefully. We have a draft UN General Assembly resolution put together with a sample statute which creates the special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression. That was handed to the president of the Ukraine about 2 weeks ago, and shortly after that he publicly announced that we should have a special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression. One thing is that another person who helped draft this UN General Assembly resolution and the sample indictment was Erwin Kotler, the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice for Canada. The three of us were really instrumental in setting up already a earlier tribunal, very similar to the special tribunal for Ukraine, called the Special Court for Sierra Leone. I think it's important for your listeners to understand is we've already done this before. We've already created a tribunal which entered into a bilateral agreement with an injured state. with a mandate to prosecute a head of state. So I think this should all give us some kind of firm hope that we can do this again.
And Jennifer, how about your proposal? Where is that?
Yeah, well, first I should say my proposal is not just mine.
Right.
I've been working with former U.S. War Crimes Ambassador David Schaffer,
Right.
Ona Hathaway of Yale Law School, Astrid Reisinger-Corsini of the University of Vienna, and Klaus Kress of the University of Cologne. So we presented this in June to a number of states. And, we've had some enthusiastic endorsements. Again, it's not very much different from what David Crane's group has been doing. And Michael, I'll just be honest, where I see the challenge is to get the votes in the General Assembly. So, Putin likes to cast this as NATO's war with Russia, and that rhetoric. Now, if he controls that narrative and says, this is only NATO's issue, we'll never get the General Assembly votes. Now, that's just his narrative. But this isn't actually an issue for the entire international community, because if Russia can invade its neighbor with impunity, then the sanctity of borders is no more. No states are safe. So the real challenge will be to make sure that countries from other regions, we need African countries leading this as well. This can't just be Liechtenstein or Latvia or even Ukraine. We need the Central and South American countries denouncing this. We need Asian countries denouncing this. And all of those countries that in February condemned the invasion, those countries that are now condemning the purported annexation, they got to put their money where their mouth is and vote for a tribunal. So this is really the challenge, to get the vote in the General Assembly and to really make this happen. Because David's right, the international community knows how to do the technical requirements. So what we now need is the vote to make this happen.
Well, this is where politics makes strange bedfellows and can get really complicated. What are the world politics related to getting those votes that Jennifer is talking about? For example, why is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court currently saying he does not favor this idea? Why is the country of France currently opposed? David or Jennifer?
Question to you, Michael.
To any of you.
The bright red thread of international criminal law is politics with a small p. It's a matter of political compromise, as the Special Court for Sierra Leone statute was being negotiated, that took about a year. That wasn't just a done deal, even though the president of Sierra Leone had asked the UN for help. It's going to have to be a political decision at the right moment where there's a comfort level where they can move forward. Right now, people are a little timid around Putin, who is rattling a rather huge saber called a nuclear weapon. And so people are they're just not quite ready to cross the threshold of a justice mechanism for aggression, because they're looking for other options, perhaps. It is unfortunate that the prosecutor at the ICC is mouthing those words. I think it is not helpful, because we do have to, in fact, prosecute the crime of aggression. In the statute that we in the statute that we drafted to create this tribunal, we clearly state that the Special Tribunal for Ukraine and the ICC would work together concurrently and together, moving forward, sharing resources, investigators, what have you. So I don't.
Let me turn to Paul for a second and ask him about the elephant in the room, and that is, Paul, should the United States be concerned about the precedent of establishing an aggression tribunal outside of the Security Council?
No.
Okay, you're very confident of that, but what if a bunch of countries went to the General Assembly and did that for Israel, and the United States could not use its veto to stop that? Isn't that something the U.S. should be concerned
I think
about?
the United States, and David and Jennifer and Melena have hit on this. The United States should be concerned about what happens when we accommodate or appease
Okay.
aggression. We did that with Crimea. We now have an all-out war against Ukraine. We got to worry about Taiwan. You need this type of justice for a durable international secure infrastructure, and we're not going to get it if we don't take Putin's invasion of Ukraine seriously and hold him and his inner circle accountable.
Paul, I'm going to let that be the final word. I'm getting the signal from our producer that it's time to bring our program to a close. I'd like to thank our experts for being with us today and helping us make sense of the complicated issue of accountability for war crimes in the Ukraine. Dr. Paul Williams, Chief Prosecutor David Crane, Professor Jennifer Trahan, and Professor Melena Stereo, thank you so much for providing your insights about this important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.